Whether you're a sketchbook enthusiast or a more seasoned artist, there's no denying the feel of experimenting with new art supplies. I am somewhat new to using markers in my sketchbook practice. While I've experimented with adding a few here or there, I've never really tested them out much beyond that. So if you are new to Tombow markers or you've been using them for years, my goal is you'll walk away with some new techniques and ideas for how to use Tombow markers, or really any type of marker, in your sketchbook. So grab your art supplies and let's get started. First, I want to walk through some basics on the Tombow marker, which are helpful if this is the first time you're using them. Something unique about these markers is how they feature a dual tip. One end is a brush tip, while the other is a fine point. Personally, I don't use the fine tip too much. I like using the brush tip more, but it's a nice option to have if you want to create thin lines with the same color. Something you have to get used to when using markers are layering. If you normally like solid blocks of color in your artwork, you may not actually enjoy the effect of using markers. You will notice when you cover a large area with color and then overlap, you get this streaking effect. So you'll need to keep in mind how you layer your marker strokes on top of each other, whether you're using them in different directions, because you'll see this show up in your artwork. For any brush tip pen, the amount of pressure you apply will affect the thickness of your stroke, so it's important to practice using the tool. The lighter the touch, the thinner the stroke, whereas the more pressure you apply, the thicker the stroke. I notice this the most when I'm using these markers to create lettering. Each time I get better at learning how much pressure to apply to get the effect I'm looking for. You could also use a colorless blender to soften the color of your markers. I don't have a Tombow colorless blender. This is a colorless blender marker from a different brand, but it probably works the same. I personally haven't experimented much with blending, but it's something I'll try out more in the future. Now getting into the sketchbook ideas. The first is fills versus lines. One technique or way you can use markers is, instead of using them as the main tool for creating lines in your art, use them to create fills instead. So here I am using a black fine line pen to draw little bouquets of flowers and using the color of the marker to fill in the flower. I also like the contrast of combining the thin pen line with the bolder marker strokes. Here's another example of how I'm adding fills to a line drawing. I started with a red Muji gel pen for the line art of this architecture. Then I went in with two different colors of markers for the fill, an orange for all the windows and most of the sign above the entrance, then a fuchsia tone to fill in some of the outlines and the lettering on top of the architecture. This is another example of how I'm using markers as a fill, but this time flooding the page with color. First, I started with an outline for a quick and simple still life of a vase of flowers. I added the bulbs of the flowers and then added a shadow and background fill, all using marker. Another tip or way to use these markers in your sketchbook is to practice lettering or calligraphy. I love using these Tombow markers for lettering. They are such a versatile tool, and there's so many ways you can go about using them to create your lettering. In this first example, I started with a Micron Graphic 1 pen for the main lettering of the word blue. Then I used a few shades of blue Tombow markers to add outlines. I started with the darkest blue, then moved on to the lighter shades to make this gradient effect. For this one, I started with a lavender, almost light blue shade of marker to draw out the lettering for the words "Hey there" in a loose script. I also added flourishes to connect the Y with the capital T, just to make the composition a little more interesting. Then I went in with a red Muji gel pen to add line art afterward. I didn't feel like the lettering looked strong enough on its own with just the marker. Adding the outline really helped to define the lettering, and it also made it an interesting color combination. I continued using the red gel pen to draw a flower on the right and better fill in the composition of the page. I'm really happy with how this quick sketch and drawing came out. Another example of how I work with these markers in lettering pieces is starting out with a well-defined outline of the lettering with a different tool, such as a black pen, one that I can have more precision with versus the brush tip pen of the Tombow marker. So here I created script lettering of the words San Francisco, first in a pencil outline, then with a black fine liner and erasing the underlying sketch. Afterward, I used a red Tombow marker to go over the lettering with an outline, which really made it pop. Consider your paper choice. Experiment with the background you're drawing on. So don't stick to just white paper, but try out different shades of white, or in this case, like mine, try out a tan or beige colored paper. Now, of course, the color of the paper will affect how the marker color shows up, so keep that in mind when you're choosing your color palette. I started off by swatching all the colors so I could see how they interact with this paper. I definitely recommend you swatch out your colors on each of the papers you use, and don't rely solely on the color of the cap, which is often misleading. Just to compare, here's what the same marker colors look like when swatched onto a white paper. Obviously, the colors will be much more vibrant, but maybe you like the way the color tones down on other papers. And a last tip or bit of advice is to compare with other markers. While I love the Tombow brush pen markers for all the color options they offer, I still recommend experimenting with other markers. You may find out you like others for different purposes. In this drawing, I'm using Copic markers in various shades of gray, starting with a light gray and then building with values to create the shadows and darker areas. So those were all my tips and ideas for how to experiment with Tombow markers in your sketchbook. Let me know your thoughts on using this tool. Leave a comment down below. Do you love them or hate them? And check out one of these videos next.